Welcome to the Strong Roots podcast. It's all about interviewing everyday, ordinary Christians who have strong roots of faith and then applying it to our own lives. Whether you are seeking, whether you're new to faith, or maybe you've been following Jesus for a really long time, come grow strong roots with us. Welcome to the Strong Roots podcast. I'm here with Pastor John, and today we are talking about my way or God's way. And Pastor John, I feel like you have a very strong will, but you have definitely submitted to God's ways in so many areas of your life. So I'm excited to talk with you about this today. But can you just start us off by explaining to us what is God's way? How can we even discern what God's way is?
Well, I think obviously his way is revealed to us through his word and then confirmed by his spirit or reinforced by his spirit, I suppose. Doesn't need to be confirmed, but the Holy Spirit, which is an aspect of God that we receive when we become Christians, that is inside of us. It's a still small voice in your heart. Very difficult to discern. But yeah, that's what we know God's will and way is for our life, primarily.
Sometimes I have people quoting Old Testament and like that is God's way. Like for somebody who is new to reading the Bible and in God's word, like how would you put a roadmap for them about explaining the Old Testament, New Testament?
Well, that's a great theological question. And I think a lot of new Christians totally get confused and a lot of times let off track. So Old Testament ceremonial law versus the new spiritual law that Jesus gives us in the new covenant is one of the primary arguments of the New Testament. So do you have to keep Jewish law? And Jesus and the apostles make it overwhelmingly clear that no, you do not. Jesus has completed the Old Testament law, the Old Covenant, the Old Deal. And now he has replaced all of the Old Testament laws, the 613 specific laws that the Pharisees followed, and the 10 Commandments and all of it with one new law. Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, in John 13:34, love one another in the same way that I've loved you, so you must love one another. And that sounds simple, but the burden of love is much higher.
Right.
It's much greater, and it's much simpler to understand. Can I do this or can I not do this? What is a loving thing to do in light of eternity? Not just right now. Like it's not loving of me to affirm a sexual ethic that doesn't honor God's best, because not only, will that not lead to your best in this life, but in eternity, even if it did lead to more joy in this life, in eternity it won't.
Right.
And so the loving thing to do is always to call us to God's best for our life.
Right. And something I think you taught me is to keep it really simple is this loving God and loving others? Like that's just a super simple way in your day-to-day to do that.
Yeah.
But Pastor, what are some characteristics of doing things your own way and not God's way? Day to day, what does this look like?
I think the biggest challenge is going to be remembering that even though we are redeemed and regenerate in Christ, our old sinful nature wants to come back from the grave. It's been put to death, but it wants to come back from the grave and zombie us and, call us to do sinful things. And I remind myself all the time, I can't trust my feelings. Right? Yeah. Ahead of God's. But like my feelings will deceive me all the time, and they still do, right? I feel sinful things all the time, and I just have to remember, and this is what I always say when it comes to my feelings. Take my feelings, shove them in a box, give that box to Jesus, let him redeem those feelings, right? Through his word, like filter it through his word, through his spirit, through, the history and tradition and wisdom of the church and others who've gone before me, and then take it back and then feel those feelings. And it's that discipline of delaying.
For you personally, what area is the hardest to not just do your way and not God's way?
I think sometimes I see, particularly when it comes to our church and staff, the needs of the church I will put ahead of an individual's dignity and feelings. And I think sometimes listening to an individual, like finish articulating whatever it is that they need to say when I already know what they're going to say and I know all the things and the reasons, long before they said it.
Yeah.
And it takes them 10 minutes to articulate that. And it's like, no, I got to pause. I got to listen to what they're going to say. This is important to them. And God's both. He cares for the church at large, but he also cares for us as individuals completely and totally. And, it's hard for me to reflect that since I'm not infinite like God. But I think a lot of times in the moment, I tend to fail at valuing an individual.
I love that you said that because Jesus knew everything. And still he listened to people.
And can you imagine that?
No.
Knowing everything they're going to say, literally knowing what happened.
Yeah.
Right? And then he has to listen to them, wax on. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're talking, I was like, that is God's way.
Right.
Okay, as a pastor, you hear a lot of stories. You see a lot of lives. In what way do you think people, our church as a whole, are struggling with this the most? Like, where do you see the struggle the most in choosing your own way over God's way?
We just did a sermon on it as we're filming this about misfires in the engine, but I think the number one way is idolizing just the things of this, like the busyness of this life, like my kids' sports, remodeling my house, camping, vacation, whatever, over God's great commission purpose for our life. And I just know, like, at the end of this life, my strong feeling and pull to do these fun things or to do these things I want to do, volunteer to do this thing, it's not going to supersede the eternal value that comes from building God's kingdom. And I think that's the biggest way. But then, I mentioned some of the other misfires we have. A sexual ethic is common. Offense, I think, is super, super common, especially when I do counseling. I think a lot of ladies struggle with offense. I have seen just the anecdote of my experience in a way that has become more acute recently is holding just a spirit of offense against, everyone for everything.
Right.
I'm hurt because they did this and they did it on purpose, and it drives families apart, it drives people apart. And it's an unredeemed feeling that we need to take that offense, shove it in a box, give it to Jesus, let him redeem it, get it back, and, give grace that we've received from him to them.
When I think about my way versus God's way, I feel like just this week, there was a time where I was like, okay, I know God's way. I'm totally going to do it. I was driving in the car. And then in your feelings, I know you already told us to shove them in a box, give them to Jesus. But I'm sure people watching this have been like, I've driven home and been like, I'm going to do this God's way. God, I give you my feelings. And then you walk into the situation and you do it your own way. Like, are there other practical steps in your Christian walk that have also helped you in those moments where your feelings are just usurping all the logic in God's way that you should be doing?
I mean, I actually know the particular circumstance she's talking about. So
because it wasn't with him. So
Christian's sister, as we're filming this, had passed away, and we went to Minnesota for the funeral. And then it was really important to me. She was coming back on Sunday, and it was really important to me that we get the kids to church on Sunday night. And she told me ahead of time, hey, it's going to be very overwhelming for me to come in. Everybody's going to want to talk to me. We listened online, and I was like, no, I want the kids in church. So we're in this big argument. Ultimately, she came to church. But yeah, we got in a big, I think you went home saying, I'm not going to fight.
Yep.
With my husband about demanding that we go to church, even though we agreed if you weren't feeling up to it, I said, hey, I totally understand.
Right.
But then in the moment, you're like, I don't feel up to it. And I was like, you can make it. Come to church.
And I gave myself the biggest pep talk. I was like, I'm going to be so godly. I submitted to my husband, God. We're good. And then the second I saw him, I was like, I am confronting him right now. And I knew that wasn't God's way. I didn't confront in a godly way. And I guess my question for you, and I mean, I have some thoughts too, but I feel like that is the biggest struggle. I think Christians in general, a lot of us know what we're supposed to do. It's the biggest gap from here to here.
Well, I don't think, to be clear, I didn't handle myself very well, particularly when I was telling you to go to church. I mean, that was where I was probably the worst. And by probably, I mean I was. I said I was very firm and not loving in demanding that happen. But I think that my poor choice didn't justify you being mean to me. And I think the old adage, two wrongs don't make a right.
Right.
But you gave your power away to your emotions.
Yeah.
And the sad part is she was totally in the right. But because of the way she treated me, I was in the right? Like
Right.
then you had to come back and apologize to me. But how many relationships have then been undone by the next level of ungodliness, which is just holding on to a grudge and letting the sun go down on our anger? And, Jesus, this is such a big deal. And this is, really what we're trying to get to in this whole thing is Jesus tells us twice in Matthew and in the Gospel of Mark that he will not forgive us if we don't forgive others, right?
Yeah.
And how many of us hold on to petty bitterness and unforgiveness emotionally, doing it our way, right? And then stop the flow of grace from God into our life.
Right.
And I think that's such a big deal. And I'm grateful that we were able to resolve that by the end of the night. But I can think of no better way to stymie the work of God in our life than, hold on to our emotions unredeemed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think this is just something that I wanted to add. I have found in my own personal life when I am fighting my way versus God's way, confessing out loud that I know my way is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think if I would have walked in and been like, "Hey John, I'm really struggling with my emotions right now. I know I did the godly thing, but I just want to let you know, I'm really wrestling and wanting to say things that I don't mean." I feel like that would have just ended it right there. But I think it's sometimes my own pride and I know what's best and I have this under control that keeps me from confessing. But I have found that confessing what's going on in my heart to those around me before I act on it, even with our kids, even when I come home from work and I'm like, "Hey, mommy's really struggling. She had a hard day." Just that confession will a lot of times keep me from, doing things my way. Like, now I'm going to lay the hammer down and my feelings are going to come out sideways and blah, blah, blah. Confession has really helped me do it God's way. Have you found that in your life too?
I feel like confession, like what you're describing. So basically you had a shook up pop can, right?
Yep.
Soda can. And it, if you open it up, it's going to explode.
Yeah.
Right. And you came home and she opened up a can, right? Big mess. Now we got a big mess. But what confession does, if you do it in that controlled manner is, you just open it a little bit so it comes out real slow and you're saying, "Okay, God, I am not going to explode. I'm going to let this out in a controlled fashion. I'm confessing that I have this ahead of time."
Yeah.
And, so many times in our relationship, you've told me, "Hey, I'm really tired. I'm hurt by some of the things you did. Here's what you said and whatever," but you've let it out in a controlled fashion. Oh, it's so much easier than coming home and being like, what you said when you came home.
The shook up.
You're not a nice person, and I'm upset with you.
Right.
So, yeah.
Exactly. So besides pride, what are ways you feel like let's keep us from confessing? Because I feel like not only in particular arguments or disagreements with people where we choose our way over God's way, but also, let's say sexual sin, let's say addictions, let's say just all these things. What are the lies you feel like are most common?
Oh, I think fundamentally, all of this comes down to sin is not that bad. I am not a bad person. And I think fundamentally, that's the big argument that we're dealing with is I don't really believe that what I'm doing is that bad. I believe that what they're doing is really bad, so that justifies what I'm doing. Or I believe that what I'm doing is fun and God shouldn't care that much about it, right?
Right.
And, I think that's the fundamental argument. When you were blowing up at me, you felt like you deserved to be able to do that.
Right. Absolutely.
And afterward, that's not the case. But I think that's the fundamental battle is, am I going to submit to Christ in this area? It's funny because I feel like, we're saved by grace in a moment. We're redeemed and we're made new in Christ in a moment. But then instant by instant for the rest of our lives, it's an opportunity to say, "Jesus, I surrender this to you too." Mm-hmm. And I trust your will and your ways. And I believe that, I'm a sinner in this way, or I'm denying that I'm a sinner. That's essentially what you were doing, right? Because you were denying, you were saying John's a sinner, but Kristen is not. Kristen's a good person. And out of your depravity, you lashed out to me instead of redeemed, shove it in a box, give it to Jesus, take it back, and give it in a humble, kind, loving fashion. You sent it at me as though you were perfect.
Right.
And I really do think pride is the root of most of it, most of our depravity. But it's, how many sinful areas of our life where we have done things that we regret after we've been Christian or become Christians, how often is it just simply in the heat of the moment, I believe I'm not a sinner.
Right.
You're a sinner, but I'm not. I'm good. I don't really need God's grace in this area, and I have to, and it's just, that's pride. But when we live from a place of gratitude, place of redemption and humility, it's pretty easy just to say, yeah, God, I need your grace, even as I'm correcting somebody else for hurting me. I know that I'm a sinner and I need grace even as I correct. It's going to be so much better.
And giving the other person the benefit of the doubt. Like giving, in a way.
I hear that phrase used all the time. You want to define that a little bit?
Yeah.
What does benefit of the doubt mean?
So even in the moment where I was weird, let's talk about that confrontation, like understanding, seeing it from your point of view. Like if I am prideful and I am saying pretty much like, I am right, you are wrong, taking the time to actually think like, okay, let me see it from John's point of view. You had a wedding, you worked all day that morning, like just actually thinking about you and like what your day looked like instead of just focusing on me, I, like
okay.
all my.
So the benefit of empathy is really what you're saying.
Yeah. Don't you think that's.
Is that what you mean when you're using the benefit of the doubt in this context or every context?
Ooh, I don't know. Well,
okay.
This context.
I think benefit of the doubt means a lot, but I think what you're saying is give the person compassion and empathy. Just walk in their shoes for a minute before you respond to them. And obviously, that's, what do they see that I don't see? How do they feel? How do they feel? Not just how do I feel? And again, I think that's a very godly perspective. That's doing it God's way. God saw us rather than his own suffering. Right. And out of love for us did that. And that is God's way. You're right. I think that's a great conclusion to this whole episode is understanding if you want to do it God's way, you got to do it God's way, which means, he saw our perspective rather than his own sufferings. And, when you're walking through almost anything in life, if we want to love like Jesus, in the same way that I've loved you, so you must love one another, you have to lay down your life like Jesus did by seeing their pain and their suffering. You could have redeemed that moment, even though I caused you a great deal of suffering and you were focused on your suffering, and the suffering I caused you admittedly was probably greater than the suffering that I was going through. But if you wanted to redeem that moment, you could have started before articulating your pain and hurt by looking at my pain and hurt.
Absolutely. Okay. But before we end, practical. Mm-hmm. So I feel like you have put a lot of boundaries in place in your life, healthy boundaries that have kept you from straying from God's ways. Would you mind sharing some of the boundaries that you have that keep you following God's ways and not your own ways?
I mean, I think some of the biggest ones are just normalizing depraved behavior through content we consume. Like, I think that's a really, really big one. We don't watch TV. We don't have a TV. Mm-hmm. We don't really do movies. And I think that's a really big deal, is not having that in our life. Because, it's funny, when I do consume a movie for at the movies, to get ready, I'm always appalled at the level of just violence or normalized debauchery that's in that.
Right.
And I think when what I consume is generally godly, it makes me want to be godly, And when what I consume with my eyes and mind and heart is ungodly, it makes me more likely to be less godly. So I think that's a big deal. It doesn't mean that you can't have TV.
Right.
But it does mean think about what you consume.
I think something else that you've modeled in our marriage is I think we both confess sin pretty quickly, even with each other, but during our day, like, hey, this happened today. I already made it right with them, but I want to tell you. Or we confess to each other, and then the other one's like, hey, you probably should go and, confess to
Make
them.
It right with that person, yeah. No, I agree.
I also think you do, like, for our marriage, and again, that doesn't mean everyone has to do this, but you don't ride alone in a car with another woman without asking permission from me.
Without asking permission. I do ride alone. Yeah. Like, we did have a couple car trips this week, but I do always call you and tell you, hey, I'm going to ride with this person. Sure.
But I feel like that's a great boundary to be like, I'm trying to live my life God's way. Like, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and I want to protect our marriage. And I don't know, I feel like there's lots of things that you have learned from people before you. I mean, this is nothing that we invented ourselves, but that have lived really godly lives and we've seen done it God's way.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to flip back? Is there any question you want to ask me before we end it?
Man, I'm sorry. I think I'm done on this subject. That's it.
That's all you got?
That's all I got.
Yay. Well, thank you, John, for being here, and thank you for answering all the questions. And thank you guys for tuning in, and we cannot wait to catch you next time. Bye. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of the Strong Roots podcast. If you enjoyed it, make sure to check us out on all our other social media platforms. And I want to let you know that I am personally praying that your roots stay strong.